Specializations, co-hosted by IFHP and VDM. IFHP, the International Federation for Housing and Planning, have joined forces with the Deltametropolis Association, and we're collaborating in a number of ways, amongst others through these monthly learning labs that we are hosting. I'm very happy that we managed this. I hope you can all hear me well. For this first session, we focused on the theme by the community for the community. So I'm very happy that we have found two speakers, Marieke Kums and Andy Fergus, to give their introductions, and then we will have some space for discussion, obviously, which I think is very welcome. This discussion we need, this more international discussion. My name is Paul Gerritsen. I'm director of the Deltametropolis Association, and I will host this session today. We normally do it a little bit together, Regitze and me. Regitze, who is the CEO of IFHP, but I believe today she unfortunately could not join. For the discussion, as you've seen already, we will record this session so that others can see it later on. Probably we will cut off the discussion. I'm not even sure, but anyhow, if you don't want to be recorded, of course, you can turn off your camera. However, I always enjoy to see all of your faces. So if you want to contribute and want to take part in the discussion and you don't object, then please turn on your camera, so then we can also see the facial expression, which sometimes really helps in understanding. So we have two speakers who both will focus on the role of communities in taking care of their own living surroundings and taking care of their housing. We have from the Netherlands, Rotterdam to be precise, Marieke Kums, who's architect and founder of Studio Max. She founded her office in 2009. She's known for their very innovative approaches, innovative designs as well. Marieke will reflect on how design processes can empower communities with examples of collaborative housing projects in the Netherlands. Marieke will be first, but after that, Andy Fergus will join. Andy and me have met each other quite some time ago in the Netherlands. We've collaborated for a number of years on a project. And Andy already at that time was very much busy with housing based on a different setting. And we compared the housing situation in Australia and the Netherlands through this collaboration. And it was always very interesting to hear the big differences, but also what these big differences lead to, in what kind of other kinds of innovative housing projects are there. So I'm very happy that you're here as well to contribute. You already said it's always a hard time to get across the specific context of a place, and that indeed is the challenge, particularly in sharing ideas and concepts internationally. So I think, well, that's why we are here and hosting these learning labs. I'm looking at Alan-Greta, she doesn't see, but to check whether I missed something, perhaps. No, then I think we will begin with Marieke. Marike, please take the
I'm
floor.
just putting some links in the chat box from previous sessions in case you are interested to see what has already been discussed.
Yes, indeed. So I missed that one. Thank you. Okay, Marike, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you, Paul, and thank you for the invitation. Yeah, so I'm an architect and I have an office. I'm also teaching in university in Germany. I'm professor there since 2 years and very much involved also in housing topics there. And I'm gonna. So I hope this is visible, no? So I was asked to talk a bit about housing cooperatives in relation to the for community by community topic for today. We are doing a research since 2 years into housing cooperatives and a housing comparison actually in housing culture between the Netherlands and Germany. This was an initiative that was started by the Dutch government. They made together with the Creative Industries Funds an open call, and they asked designers to think about how to work differently on housing and how to help Holland out of the housing crisis, which is kind of a challenge. Just to start with, to get a little bit of an image about the housing situation, the Netherlands is actually a country where there's a huge amount of housing ownership. Around 71% of people own the house that they live in. That's very different, for example, to countries where housing cooperatives are rather popular, such as Austria, Germany, and Switzerland. And cooperative capital, maybe Berlin, where 16% of people only own the house. So there's a very small owner market. And in the other countries, it's only half of the housing that is owned. So that's a rather big gap with the Netherlands. That also means people in the Netherlands tend to really appreciate house ownership. And actually, there was a nice study. They say people vote more to the right if they own the house because they feel they're safe and they don't have to spend so much money on social security for other people, let's say. So that's definitely also something to do with solidarity. Of those houses or in those countries, the percentage of housing cooperatives in the Netherlands is less than 1%, so around 0%, while in the other countries where there's less house ownership, there is more people that are part of a housing cooperative. So that those kind of numbers relate very much to each other. We've been studying the situation for housing cooperative or cooperative housing forms in Germany and trying to map them, also compared to the Netherlands. Netherlands is a bit of a desert at the moment for housing cooperatives. The ones that you see, the yellow ones, they're actually management cooperatives. So there is a form of cooperative living, but people do not own the cooperative together. The ownership is often with the social housing corporation. I can talk a little bit more about it later. What is actually housing cooperative? I think in the Netherlands, there's a lot of talk about this topic. Of course, it's a very popular topic already for many years in other countries as well. But basically, it's a legal entity, usually a cooperative of a corporation, which owns real estate consisting out of one or more residential buildings. It is membership based and each member is allowed to live there. So to say it in a more simple way, there's many different variations, but basically it means that you collectively own the place that you're living in. But when you leave the cooperative, you don't get a piece of the cooperative, you just leave and somebody else takes your place. So the ownership always stays within the legal form, the entity of the corporation. I'm just going to talk specifically about Germany, not about Switzerland and Austria, because this is not my specialty, let's say. But so in Germany, there are 5 different ways how the community is legally organized within a housing cooperative, which is a cooperative or it's a VOF, or a housing association, or a normal association, or a limited company. There is somebody, can somebody switch off his microphone? Thank you. Going back to the situation in Germany, we are actually studied 10 or like a lot of projects in Germany, but 10 specifically, and also 5 in the Netherlands. and went through the whole process, like who initiated it, how were they made, who owns it, etc. And this is somehow what I will talk a little bit about in the next minutes, that we're making this book with case studies to also help tell these stories also in the Netherlands, where a lot of people at the moment are actually working on housing cooperatives, and where there's not so much knowledge yet there. We structured the book in a way, or each case study, about who took the initiative, how was the building made, so how is the architecture made, but more also in what way, how does it serve the people in a way, then how does the community live in the building, and how is it legally organized, and how was it financed. So basically how to make a housing cooperative. I'm going to show a few examples because I think each project is really unique, and I think that's also what makes it so beautiful. It's really made by and for the people that live there. That's very different, of course, than if a social housing corporation, for example, makes a project. Of course, you trust them to make the best project ever for the people that will live there, but they don't make it together with the inhabitants. And they also choose who will live there because there's waiting lists, etc. But with the housing cooperative, the people can actually decide how it is designed, how it will look like, that they also choose with whom they will live there. So it's a very strong community sense. There's a much stronger feeling of solidarity in those kind of projects. And usually the mutation rate of people moving in and out is very low. People tend to live for a long period there. A famous housing project in Berlin is called Spreeveld. Perhaps people here know this project. It was started in 2009 in the previous housing crisis or financial crisis, let's say, by an action group that wanted to keep the River Spree banks public. The city decided to sell the land to them, and they made a project on the River Spree. I think it's around 80 apartments, I thought. I need to check the numbers, but like a quarter of all the program is actually community program. So this is another characteristic of those kind of projects. It's just not pure housing. There's a lot of other functions that helps to create this community, not just for the inhabitants between themselves, but also towards the neighborhood, to how to anchor such projects in the neighborhood. So there's standard apartments, but there's also living groups, cluster units. It's almost 50-50. They're on all the upper floors. This is kind of a communal living area with a shared kitchen. But there are also private apartments that do not share anything. This is also a bit of a discussion that is being held quite often, is that a housing cooperative doesn't mean you have to share everything. I think you can choose how much you share with your fellow inhabitants, or if you have an entirely private apartment. The ground floor is entirely with private or a social program like daycare workspaces. They're rented out to the community, so they also earn money. The project works really well. Also, when somebody gets another child and the apartment is too small, they can just switch apartments within the building. They don't have to sell the house and buy the house, etc. It's all very comfortable. The rents are still super low, 8.5 euros per square meter rent. And in Berlin at the moment, it's 18.5. So it's almost triple the price of a normal apartment, which is one of the main characteristics also of housing cooperatives, to keep the rents affordable. This is another project in Berlin. I show it because it's a very different way of doing a cooperative. It's done by a rather professionalized organization that is existing already for 30 years. They have a long waiting list. They own multiple buildings. It's a long waiting list of people that want to live in one of their buildings, and they recently completed a new project. They planned and built it in 3 years' time, so very fast. It's almost 100 apartments, and it's next to the railway, so the land was very cheap, but they zoned it in a way that all the collective living areas are next to the railway in the quiet areas, and the private bedrooms are towards the neighborhood. Here, the inhabitants were not part of the design process, actually, which is usually a very positive point, but with a big group, this can also be very complicated. But on the other hand, they were very much involved in creating the community of the fellow inhabitants. So there's still a big feeling of being part of something and being able to contribute to your own living environment. This is, it's entirely built in wood. It's won a lot of prizes in Germany. So still, it can also, even very affordable buildings can bring a lot of innovation and quality there. Also here, it's a very cheap rent. It's even there's some subsidized apartments by the Berlin city. They're even only €6.50 per square meter. So it's a very, very comfortable way to live also in places that are getting really expensive. There's another project, it's in Fürth, it's in the south, close to Nuremberg. Those projects are not always initiated by very kind of radical groups or activists or already established organizations. These were just a group of friends that inherited a piece of land and they thought we're gonna live there. They realized it's very big. So they decided to make a much bigger buildings there. It's around 60 apartments, I believe, a very varied group of people. And they have also apartments there for refugees, for single mothers, care apartments that are partially subsidized also by the city. So it's a big collaboration. And they really worked also like to kind of write the program of people that would live there. They usually, a lot of people above 55 years old, they're very eager to live in those projects. They have time to organize it. They have a lot of money. But they really made a conscious choice to have very young families to very old inhabitants and people with money, people without money. It's also a mix of partially owned apartments and partially housing cooperative apartments. So it's a very kind of tailored project, beautifully designed by architects in Germany that are also often more experienced with organizing the processes that are involved in creating those kind of projects with larger groups of people. Also here, it is quite cheap to live, very affordable. Housing cooperatives can take whatever form. There's even these kind of farmhouses. There's a lot of those in the Netherlands also at the moment, especially in the south of the Netherlands, that they want to transform into collective housing projects. In this case, it was not so easy to really give the housing a pure cooperative form because of a financing structure. They had to get a lot of private funding. The banks didn't allow them to be in a cooperative because then they would not have the, how do you call this in English? In Dutch, it's the pand, the onderpand. The building is the guarantee for the bank. But then they said, okay, if this is not possible, we make another housing cooperative that is in charge of the farm shop. They work the lands, they do cultural programs. So it is not just about the bricks, it's also a lot about the programming, how the community works together, and how it is organized and how it creates a community also here with the surrounding village and what they mean for that community. So it's very much also an attitude and a decision to live in a certain way. There are some examples in our book also from the Netherlands, also of recently completed projects, also De Warren and the Nieuwe Meent, which are quite famous now in the Netherlands. Most of you will have heard about it. I quickly, this is a less famous project. It's in Groningen, but it's also quite interesting. It is actually a housing community for 55 plus people, which is a big group of people in the Netherlands that are looking for a new way to live after all their kids left the house and their own house is too big, but they don't have anywhere else to move to. In Groningen, the city helped them to acquire a piece of land and they built around 50 apartments there. Here, the money was not necessarily a problem because a lot of these people just sold their house. So they were allowed to invest in the cooperative, but maximum 100,000 euros. And in a lot of cases, other cooperatives, they have really difficulty bringing all the money together to have the project financed. That was not the problem here. They have a really strong knit community. They do a lot of activities. Every day there's something to do what they can do together, and they live in the center of Groningen. Half of the houses is average rent or a mid rent. Half of it is social rent. So there's a difference in price, and it depends how much you earn for which apartment you qualify. But there's a huge feeling of solidarity in this project. Two, you see immediately that also in the Netherlands, even when there is no profit made with this project, it's a non-profit project financed mostly by people themselves, the rents usually are much higher than they are in Germany. And this is actually rather cheap. So it's kind of social rent is the standard social rent in the Netherlands. So it is very affordable, but it's 1.5 times more expensive than the same category in Germany. I can talk a lot about these kind of projects. I think there's a huge potential in the Netherlands for management cooperatives, such as projects like Bosgaard and W1555 from Superuse. They're not owned by the inhabitants, they're owned by the social housing corporation, but nevertheless, the inhabitants are totally in control of their own environment, and they don't have to deal with the burden of getting the financing for the projects or acquiring the land, but they have the benefit of community living and making the community together. The book is coming out in 2 months, I think. I hope it will help to stimulate the discussion about collective housing forms in the Netherlands. That's it. Thank you for your time and attention. And if you have questions, please let me know.
Yes, great. Thank you very much, Marieke, for this very, very insightful presentation. Indeed, if there's direct questions, it would be good to have them on the table now so that we can clarify perhaps something. Anyone? Nadia.
Thank you, Marieke, for this presentation. Very, very insightful, of course. I was wondering, a couple of years ago, I did a project with habitants in Rotterdam, and they were financed partially because the government had a subsidy, like the IPSV subsidy. So innovative projects, urban development, and it was like €1 million. So that was their finance to start their building. And I was wondering, is this still available nowadays for people to have a kind of finance from the government?
There is a lot of things going on. There are finances. I think the most promising one is that they're making a revolving fund for housing cooperatives of €40 million, in which they can actually finance the project. So, but it's a loan system. So as soon as the cooperative is able to build the building and people start paying their rents, the money feeds back into this fund, and the next project can use this fund to support their project. I know that different municipalities are supporting cooperative housing groups with startup funds, because it's not so easy, for example, to have often you have to have like a schematic design or something for your building before you can actually start applying for funding, etc. And those things all need to be pre-financed. For those phases, there are fundings available, but they're usually more city-based, community-based. For example, the project from Groningen that I just showed, they also received the finance from the city to develop the first phase of the project. But the 1 million sounds quite like a lot. I don't know, which project was it?
In Rotterdam.
Which one?
Bisboetelius. It's on the corner of the Rozenemanstraat and the Bruinstraat. And it was for mostly Turkish habitants.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm really into the cooperative projects. So this sounds also like a support for a kind of a cultural group. So I also don't know this fund necessarily.
It was not necessarily, but it resulted in this because a lot of buildings were demolished and a lot of Turkish people were living there.
Yeah.
So that's why.
I can totally imagine.
For everyone.
Good. Well, anyhow, it's a good question because of this like financing of these projects, particularly in the Netherlands. I've heard of many that had to get a mortgage from German banks because they were not able to get it done in the Netherlands, actually. So it's always a big issue.
But I spoke to these banks also. They do want to finance it. The Rabobank now is able to do so. The difficulty is that the housing cooperative as a living form is not anchored in the law correctly. So basically in the Netherlands, it is seen like kind of a private business. So banks are allowed to give a loan to a private person or to a business, but not to a private business. So it's a way for them to do due diligence that they cannot loan big amounts of monies to those kind of organizations. So they are very interested and they're slowly changing. And the German banks, they have already embedded that in their financial system and therefore they're able to give these loans. Yeah.
Okay, interesting. Good. We have Jonas and Claudio still small questions, I hope. Jonas, go ahead.
Yes, thank you for the presentation, Marike. Very concise and insightful. I had two questions. Correct me if I'm wrong, please, but I believe in Germany, the ownership is also coupled with shares. So the owners also have a share in the project, and when they leave, they get part back of it. I believe there is a construction with the rent that they have to pay. And I believe in the Netherlands, it's not the case. They can begin with a start contribution, but that's it. They cannot, the rent is not used as a share. I heard this from the architect of the new amendment, actually, but I'm not totally sure this is working. And my question would be, how does it work if it's that system in Germany with, for example, children of share owners when they move? Can they hand it over to their children or to anyone else? Of if the shareholder is moving, everybody has to move.
Whether it's based on shares or not is totally free to choose in the Netherlands and in Germany. So it's totally up to the people that make the housing cooperative. And both cases are possible. So for example, the Warre in the Netherlands, they work in a way that people have shares. But they they do differently. They register how long people live in the housing cooperatives, and when they leave, they don't get the money then, but they get the money when the entire loan is paid off. But that's kind of a pension for the inhabitants. A lot of them are freelancers, so they actually invest and they get it in 20 or 25 years. For them, it's fine. But this is the deal that they made. But it's also complicated in Amsterdam because they have the erfpacht situation. So the city also doesn't really allow that they make profit with the building. So there's all kinds of special situations. And in Germany, there's very different, every project is different. So you can do the shares, but you can also do it without. Yeah.
Okay.
And about children of, for example, in Groningen, if a person dies at some point, the children even then don't get the money. They have to wait until the entire project is paid off. So it's really everything is in the contract and how they set it up beforehand. Yeah.
Okay. Claudio, short question.
Yeah, thank you. Could you clarify, did you find any pattern of land supply? I mean, what kind of outcome in terms of ownership rights? And but basically, I'm interested on whether you identify any pattern through which land is supplied to encourage cooperative housing, because it's a way to promote affordability. If you, in the calculations or the construction of the project, you embed the land price.
This is a very difficult topic, indeed, to get the land for a good price. If it's a public tender, like EU way organized, it's very difficult for cooperatives to compete with market parties, basically, no? In those cases, it often goes wrong. So I think the most successful cases is when cities actually make a policy and when they give land just for cooperatives. So for example, in Amsterdam, they're now doing this, and in Utrecht in the Netherlands, but also since a couple of years in München. It's the most expensive city in Germany. And the city said, okay, to make it affordable at all, we now give from all the land that we give out, 30% goes only to housing cooperatives. So I think that's the most efficient policy to make policy. No? And to give cooperatives a chance. But I think the cities only start doing it when it's actually already quite late, no? And in Rotterdam, don't want to do it, and it is a really big issue and a big topic. There are also housing cooperatives in Germany that are just privately bought or private land, and there's many variations possible. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. The reason is because we had a convening event as well between Germans and Dutch and French housing operators. And the Germans clearly articulated to us that access to land was a huge problem here. And, you know, they're facing a huge problem here in Germany. Thank you.
They are, yes. But it's being acknowledged. So what I said, like, for example, München only started doing this 5 years ago, and it's working, and there are being a lot of housing cooperatives being realized. But the city need to take action in this case. There's less and less land available. Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Claudio, for this short but big question in a way. I've let you ask a little bit more questions because I believe Marika needs to leave at 3:10, so there's still some time, hopefully, after Andy presents, but not that much. So maybe that also tempts me to still give Marie the words, since otherwise perhaps you won't be able to ask your question. So please go ahead, Marie.
Yeah, thank you, Paul, and thank you, Marika. I guess briefly, and that's what Claudio mentioned. In France, well, in certain part of France, the question of the land is, of the price of the land is an excessively difficult one. Just for your information, I was while preparing, I was reading that most cooperatives are developed by social housing movement. And to give you an idea, in France in 2023, 7,400 flats were starting with the cooperative. If you put it in regard of within a century, 400,000 flats were built. So now it's coming back either with social housing, the major source, and also of collective initiatives with local authorities. But again, it's the problem, the price of the land, which is huge. Thank you.
Not really a question. Marie was just a comment in a way, yeah? Yeah. Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for now, Marika. I hope we will be able to join you in the conversation later on. Still, that depends a little bit on Andy's talk. So please, Andy, please go ahead.
Thank you, Paul. Interestingly, I could have almost given a follow-up lecture about my research on cooperative housing over the last 4 years, which is not what I'm about to do, but that would have perhaps been a nicer compliment. My research has actually been much more focused on Zurich, where a quarter of all housing are co-ops, and there's an incredibly mature ecosystem of government support, even down to design competitions, which are run for opportunities for sites based on a really robust criteria. But I am not going to talk about that. If you bear with me just a moment, I'm going to talk a little bit about the Melbourne housing context, and the irony is not lost on me that Tom Elves is sitting in this meeting, who's probably one of the foremost experts in Melbourne housing. I thought I'd get away with someone who wouldn't necessarily know about all this context. So bear with me, Tom, and send me your critiques tomorrow. I thought it was really important to sort of situate any conversation. Obviously, Marika, with your explanation of a range of Central European housing contexts, Australia is remarkably different, both in its pattern of settler colonisation and the way land was distributed from the earliest point, through to the sort of ownership patterns and the role of government in urban development now. So I was hoping to go through a little bit of background just to sort of set the scene for that cross-cultural translation. Then I'm going to talk a bit about some models that are emerging really within a market context in Melbourne. And then I'll talk in particular about a housing model called Nightingale, which is not community-led. It is, in essence, an off-the-plan speculative apartment development, but the way in which it interacts with a sort of wait list of community members and then facilitates space for community formation is what becomes quite extraordinary. So it's an interesting model. And obviously there's a number of these emerging now in Copenhagen as well, where private developers are entering into the collaborative housing space in new ways and sort of providing new models within that. I'm joining you from Melbourne today. I'm in the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri Willem people of the Kulin Nation. So I just wanted to extend my respects to their elders past and present. It's a really important thing in Australia. We are on land that was never ceded from the traditional owners, and that's becoming a really big part of any conversation in the urban environment that we have. So in terms of talking about the context, I love this image because let's not forget the sort of mindset of the British when they send a bunch of people through transportation off to Australia as cheap labour in the colony. So we've got this classic painting of Georgian London in the 18th century, the slum era, the over capacity jails, and this need to get convicts out of that system. At the time Australia is settled, the US colony has been lost. There's now a need for new places to send convicts, and this shapes some of the early patterns of Australian settlement. So when you see this kind of founding principle of Melbourne on the right, you see this kind of idea of agricultural self-sufficiency, this bucolic ideal, and this desire not to repeat the condition of London at that time. And this finds its way into some of the earliest decrees in the colony about how land will be settled, and essentially a kind of premise of never again will we repeat that condition that we had before. And what's really interesting about this pattern of settlement, a combination of squatters who are able to sort of extend their territory at a very low cost, and then essentially the government method of making income was to sort of clip the ticket at the customs house for the exports that were produced on the land. That was the principal method. But I love looking at the basis plan in Rotterdam in 1865, the expansion of the city walls, the new single network that's constructed at that time. And you look at Melbourne's frontier has already expanded a remarkable distance at a sort of comparable timescale. So we often think of sort of, American post-war sprawl as being a car-based phenomena. Australian cities were sprawling 100 years before that, remarkably, because of this method of how land subdivision progressed well ahead of kind of traditional city-based planning. And also the lack of need for things like fortification because of the way in which the colony was settled in a single hit by one colonizing nation. This is a diagram, Paul, you might remember of quite a few years ago when we're having conversations about metropolitan competitiveness versus a sort of networked urban region. And yes, this is the same scale. So on your map, we've got Zuid-Holland, we've got essentially Rotterdam, Delft, Den Haag, and Leiden in the pink. In the Melbourne context, you can see that single monocentric city biased very much to the east, but spanning almost 100 kilometres north-south and 100 kilometres east-west. A city population of over 5 million for comparison within that urban area, but essentially a 10-hour journey across the country to the nearest capital of equivalent scale. So these big metropolitan regions that are super dominant within each province or state, which are incredibly far apart and essentially based on air travel in between one another. So within that context, and you obviously have this founding principle of how land was carved up, there's a real commitment, particularly post-war, to this idea of home ownership as a foundation of the society. And Marika, I loved your stat about 70% because it's quite surprising to me. We're currently at 67% in Australia, but that's declined over the years as a result of growing unaffordability. But I love this quote that comes from our Conservative Prime Minister in the post-war era. Citizens committed to mortgages tend not to be revolutionaries. And it's this idea that if you can tether people to debt in their housing, then they're going to make decisions that are they're going to be more likely to be conservative than to be radical. And this is such a foundational aspect that influences Australian society now. In a policy context, we talk about affordability, and the next page of the newspaper talks about capital growth and gains for investors in home ownership, which is such an interesting conundrum that we have. We have an owner-based electorate, and that very much influences our politics. The period of time where we see the greatest government action in the delivery of public housing is essentially the era post-war. So a lot of these Victorian era or late 19th century workers' cottages areas built around factories, brick pits, tanneries, etc. in the inner area becomes slum conditions through the Depression. You have incredible overcrowding, lots of issues around sanitation. And in response to that, there's a large slum reclamation program that takes place. And at this point, the government has their highest level of investment and is providing housing for a broad basis of society. But this is a bit of a blip in time as we sort of follow this through the oil crisis and particularly the declining commitment from the federal government into the pool of money that was available for social housing. We see a dramatic decline, only really rescued at points in time by brief periods of stimulus, such as during the global financial crisis. So it's within that context that you see this kind of 10-year breakup within the Melbourne context from 2021. So ownership combined fully rented mortgages at 67%. We see social rental in this case hovering at about 3% and affordable housing at another perhaps 1%. When you start to go into inner capital city regions, you see that start to flip. So you do see figures of upwards of 55, 60% rental in the capital city municipalities. But as a rule of thumb, you have this absolute dominance of ownership. And the policy doctrine around that constantly reinforces it. So the tax settings in Australia very much prioritise home as wealth creation and a stability into retirement. So our system is designed that essentially you'll live off your property wealth in a self-funded retirement. The state pension system performs a very limited role. We have a sort of outsourced, privileged superannuation sector that provides for that income later in life, and home ownership is at the moment a really big part of this, which is a real challenge as we shift away from that. The other thing to set the scene around apartment living in Melbourne in particular, before I show what I'm going to show you as innovation in the local context, is that the standards for apartment construction were exceptionally low. These apartments were largely built between 2010 and 2015. Tom, who is on the line, was quite pivotal in bringing in the first apartment standards Melbourne had had in a period of over about 25 years, which coincided with a big boom. And why I'm interested in this kind of low quality boom that was occurring at that time is, Paul, when we were meeting with Deltametropolis and talking about innovation that had occurred in the crisis, places like Spore Zone or Buckslotterham, projects where the state had pivoted their tactic to look at citizen agency in a time where the top end of town wasn't building. Actually, the innovation in Melbourne came at a time of boom. It actually came in a time where the production of very low quality apartments wasn't catering to a sector of society, and therefore there was a desire for alternative models to emerge. And while they've persisted through a period of crisis, which we're going through now, of a different kind, nonetheless, they emerge in a boom period, which I think is an interesting thing to reflect on in looking at the two contexts. In terms of apartment standards, we saw a huge decline. Interestingly, a rule that was brought in to facilitate adaptive reuse of older heritage buildings through things like loft mezzanines created something we call borrow light, where you no longer had to have a window and ventilation to a bedroom. So we started to see exceptionally poor apartment standards, apartments built 2 or 3 meters from a neighboring property, bedrooms with a sort of what we call a snorkel or a saddlebag of light to the facade, incredibly deep floor plates, and really sort of challenging outcomes. And what we can really see is this extraordinary spike, and this was heavily fueled by mainland Chinese, Malaysian and Singaporean investment in the Australian apartment market, so very much geared towards investor-oriented housing. And this was seen by government as a way of providing private rental by another means. So instead of large-scale institutional rental owners, which has only become a thing in Australia really in the last 5 years, that kind of build to rent. I know you have Greystar and a number of similar operators that we have in Australia, but it's a very recent phenomena here. Really this kind of off the plan investor market. You see that peak in 2016, 2017, before foreign investment laws had a dramatic impact on how that supply was achieved. So we don't have the breadth of actors to provide that private rental currently in the market because the market has been designed so heavily towards promoting ownership. So within that context, really what has been interesting is that a lot of the innovation has tended to be clustered in the kind of what we often talk in income bands. So the sort of, maybe you often use the term starters in the Netherlands. Perhaps we're talking about somewhere between sort of, young professionals, people in moderate to low end of high income. But the market traditionally is really only providing the absolute top, or you have subsidised housing provided in very scarce quantities in the city. So at the moment, I think we've got 60,000 people on the social housing waitlist in Victoria. The average wait period for the priority waitlist, I believe, last I checked, was 18 months for someone in high need for social housing, let alone the whole raft of people who are stuck between private rental, which is incredibly unaffordable and low quality, and eligibility for social housing, because their eligibility is quite low because of that concentration effect. The less social housing you have, the more it's concentrating the higher needs within that housing, which creates all sorts of other challenges in cities. So within that context, I've been really, since about 2016, researching sort of a range of models, Marika, and a similar sort of trajectory as you. Interestingly, I spent a lot of my time focusing on ownership models, particularly Baugruppe in Germany. But what was fascinating was to track that over time, was to see the declining relevance of ownership in being a legitimate form of affordability. And so my journey went from really being focused on Baugruppe to starting to see cities like Berlin pivot away from Baugruppe, where they were seeing, I think there was a great quote where it said, immense benefits to discrete few individuals, where essentially you would create wealth building opportunities through creating a plot for Baugruppe, because that ability for someone to on-sell it and make a profit within a period of time meant that stock was lost to the city, as opposed to a cooperative, Baugenossenschaft, various forms they might describe it, where you get that rent stabilization, that protection of that asset against speculation, essentially. So in looking in the Melbourne context, and this is a sort of inner Melbourne radius, so perhaps 10 or 12 k's from the central city, you can see this interesting spatial pattern of innovative housing models that were starting to pop up during this time. We hosted an exhibition during 2021 or 2022, I believe it was, and essentially brought together everyone who was building innovative projects in a temporarily adapted car park in the city, which was to do with COVID distancing, if we remember that. It was not so long ago. And some of the things that came out of this that were really fascinating compared to some of the things Marika's sharing about the role of government in either providing guarantees or providing seed finance, favourable conditions, access to land. What we saw here was an environment where government had absolutely no role in this emerging housing sector. So the government focus was either in enabling a supply of any market housing, i.e. high income, through the normative operation of the planning system, or focusing scarce opportunities on highest need groups for social and affordable housing outcomes. This growing gap in the middle was not being catered to at all. I think another really interesting thing that came out of this was the role of lineage and mentorship between innovators over time, and particularly the role of architects in this space. So of this table that you can sort of see here, more than half are architects. A number of them had started models in order to build their own housing, which is a not uncommon trend. And often they were then sort of pioneers putting their own money on the line in order to create an opportunity for a project. But it was really interesting to have the same workshops with state government stakeholders, local government stakeholders, and then with private actors to hear how cross purposes they talked. And what really we learned from this is that this sector, the collaborative housing sector, or this kind of emerging market innovative housing sector, had no voice, had no lobby group, didn't know how to talk to government. So there's some real challenges in how they were able to represent themselves and have the right ask when they were talking to about potential policy reform. So some of these models I wanted to talk about, and our context is very different to yours, which is why I wanted to use this dodgy street view photo of this. This would have to be 85% of the surface area of our city is essentially suburban tract housing. It's incredibly difficult to renew in a sort of intentional, integrated urbanism sense with all the public realm improvements that sort of need to come to support density. So we talk about densification of the city, but there's a risk of just laying down sprawl twice over this same sort of environment without that infrastructure. But there's some interesting models that are emerging in this sector as a sort of efficient way to redevelop. So Wise Housing, this is actually about 3 months from completion, this project, but unfortunately all I have is a render and photos of stud walls. So I just thought I'd show you the render. But this is a model where someone is saying, essentially, I'm going to target single parent households as a sort of particular cohort group or proxy who have some income, some deposit, but not enough, not anywhere enough to house the number of children or dependents that they might have. So this situation was looking at a shared equity model where your mortgage and deposit would be for half of the value of this property. So in this case, this is an $800,000 townhouse in a northern Melbourne suburb. But by halving that, you were able to have access to a property at a lower rate. Unlike other sorts of rent to buy models, which you might be aware of, say in the UK system, you only pay off the mortgage component of the house. So you're servicing a mortgage on 50% of the value. There's no other residency charge on top of that. And this sort of share in the value creation of that property is held by an institutional landowner who holds the 50%. So Wise Housing is looking at a model and saying, well, institutional investment is generally wanting to see big build to rent 300 plus apartment projects. I think the current average build to rent size in Australia is 352 dwellings per project. Pretty hard to find sites like that with some regularity. This model is saying if we build lightweight timber infill housing in the suburbs, can we get to 1,000 of them efficiently of many small individual projects? So while I'm showing you a very custom little building, which is essentially a pilot, as a model, the financial intelligence is really about how you can have this distributed scale of production and efficiency across a larger area. That's the thesis. We'll see how it plays out in a few years' time. The next one, which is an interesting trend that's emerging here, we don't have carbon penalties on buildings if you demolish. So you can demolish a significant, 8-story concrete framed office building and your new building is only held to the sort of regular standard. So there's not true economic incentives yet for repurposing. But what's occurred now, and there's 3 notable projects in inner Melbourne where essentially you've got a stuck site, or as Case Christianse calls a breaking factor in the sort of urban rules, where essentially you've got an existing flat block or apartment building that could not be rebuilt anew. So this is a site in inner Melbourne Fitzroy where if you were to knock this down and rebuild it to contemporary standards, planning, parking requirements, building code, essentially your yield would diminish. So for the demolition of the building and the construction of a new one, your return relative to your capital costs would mean no project. So within that environment, this project had a look at a sort of major retrofit. It proved unfeasible. They then looked at a bare bones, just enough retrofit and were able to focus entirely on the building systems, its carbon and the sort of environmental performance overall. And through this, an impact investor, so a small private family securing individual financiers, was able to finance the retrofit of this project based on a cash flow revenue into the future that would see the paying off of these benefits. And that means the investment upfront in sustainable infrastructure is carried by that investor. They see the benefit because the reduction in build costs, of course, is a reduction on the rental costs for those homes. So they're able to balance that out in the investment. So there are 3 of these projects. One is King William Street, Fitzroy. There's another one in Brunswick. And there's another one actually 3 streets away in Fitzroy as well. But the reason they have all happened, which is fascinating, is they were always in one line. They were held as one asset, which is not super common in Melbourne, and that the planning controls prevented the highest and best use, resulting in demolition. So I think it's a really interesting phenomenon to think about models for retrofit. And actually, I think of, thinking about Zurich context, there's a cooperative, Marika, you might have come across, called Vogeno. I don't know how to say it, Wogeno. And it's actually a sort of platform cooperative for distributed retrofits. And they have a huge number of properties they organize as a system, which are actually all little individual buildings. Sometimes they'll operate as a network within a neighborhood. Sometimes they're fully autonomous. But it's a really interesting system to renew buildings rather than individual condominium or strata title, as we would call it, individual homeowners trying to stump up the finance for the retrofit, which is incredibly difficult. Having a single entity like a cooperative to do that is really ideal. In terms of a model which has had an interesting trajectory here based on ownership, I mean, I think the closest thing to this would be CPO, which I'm not going to attempt to pronounce that because my Dutch is not very good. But this is an example of collective private commissioning, essentially, where you have a series of intending homeowners come together, co-finance, and act as a developer. They're exposed to all the downside of development risk, but they're also seeing the benefit of affordability that comes out of this. What's interesting is property collectives as a facilitator company, almost like a development manager, essentially, or a project sponsor, originally started doing this for people who were interested in kind of making a co-investment. And the founder wanted to build his own home and did that with a series of friends, was able to develop a legal instrument that was a really elegant way of doing that. What has subsequently happened is he's built upwards of 80 homes now, and he's become a kind of lightning rod for other intending eco-villages, co-housing communities who are not able to speak to banks keeping in mind in Australia, you have to compete entirely within the market. There are no subsidies, there are no supports for these sorts of models. And so by having this professionalized facilitation for groups to form, property collectives have been able to grow and provide this service. And their most recent project, which is super high environmental performance, low embodied carbon project in Victoria Street, Brunswick West, where we see this shift to a sort of low-rise walk-up apartment. And now a number of eco-villages are emerging. So this is an interesting model based around ownership. The biggest barrier to this model to us to date, and I understand it's the same with CPO, is the high equity contribution. So if you want to participate in a development of this type, you would need 35% of the value of your property to stump up upfront, not at the completion phase, but to actually cash flow the construction. So that amount of money to secure the land, to secure the opportunity. We've been joking that these are becoming de facto retirement villages because the only people who have that kind of equity lying around are people in later stages of life who are able to sell a property, downsize, and move into this. So at the moment, the innovation opportunity is actually to cross-subsidize higher net worth individuals who are downsizing as a co-investor in rental stock that might be within the same model. So looking at these kind of hybrid models where we're able to get rental and ownership into the same model. Another model that's emerged with a much more of a focus on scale and again on ownership is essentially this model of build to rent to own. And this model is essentially where people agree. So Assemble is the developer of this. I worked for Assemble for 4 years before I finished up there late last year. And essentially what this model is that you have an opportunity to rent at an agreed rate for 5 years. The community forms during that period. You form bonds with your neighbours, etc. That then converts into a sale that happens in year 5. And at that point, residents take over the building. It reverts to individual titling. But the purpose of it is to provide that certainty of a hurdle at which people can buy at an agreed rate and essentially rent for that period. Interestingly, this model was aimed at 25 to 35-year-olds with the assumption that people would be able to convert after that 5 year. What's been occurring is that the demographic is at least 10 to 15 years older than that target range because the rental is so high in that early period that it's a major barrier to people being able to access the model. So even though you have that predictable price, essentially that rent period still is making it difficult for you to save during that ensuing period. The same developer, Assemble, is now building larger built-to-rent models, but the built-to-rent models are essentially a joint venture with the equivalent of a housing corporation, like a Voncoop or a Havenstede. And essentially, in this case, a large community housing provider takes 20% of the housing stock within an overall blended development model. That is not required by government. It doesn't give them any preferential access to land. Interestingly, it de-risks supply because you've got 20% guaranteed income from the subsidy that comes for that housing, but also that then attracts other forms of preferential finance, including tax discounts and other things, which means the whole capital stack for the project becomes more attractive. So having this mixed income model and this joint venture with a community housing provider allows them to actually have a feasible project where all of the rental comes down. So in an environment where the building immediately east of this, which is Greystar, will be between 22 and 25% above market rent, this project will have 20% social housing and the balance will be at market rent. So an interesting example again of these kind of hybrid models totally occurring within the market. So what I wanted to get to as my final projects or model is Nightingale. I'm not sure if any of you have sort of heard of this model. I did have the opportunity to walk around the site with a few people from Rotterdam in the last week. Vincent Tapkin from New Industry, if any of you know here, has been in Australia the last few weeks, and we've sort of had an opportunity to walk around. And also Eva from Deltametropolis has just had an opportunity to visit. And what's really interesting about this model, this is essentially an off-the-plan model, as I sort of alluded to. The model relies really heavily on a kind of wait list of intending residents that are like-minded. That becomes a kind of sieve or filter for the community. And so the building is provided almost as a shell with the infrastructure that will enable community. There's a period of sort of fostering community formation during the build phase in terms of active facilitation from the developer. But we joke that when the building's over, there's a mic drop event where essentially the developer walks away, the community's left with the building, and it's up to them to run. What's interesting though is what scale. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. So the first project was a kind of impure pilot, which you'll often see with these models. It was intended to be co-developed with a series of architects together. They were not able to secure finance. They ended up selling and joint venturing with a development partner who built the permit that they'd achieved pretty much as intended. But as an off-the-plan project, it was the kind of proof of concept. So zero car parking at the time, a very high environmental performer, timber frame balconies, lightweight facades, really high performing thermal envelope, lots of use of recycled materials. Every apartment is cross-ventilated, communal laundries, communal rooftop facilities, communal veggie gardens, etc., in a very dense environment that has exceptionally low levels of public amenity. Off the back of this project and the immense interest in tours, design week events, various organisations promoting it, a group of interested and prospective residents started to form. Off the back of the success of that project, immediately across the road, Nightingale 1 was developed, which was the first pure form of the model. So in this case, we have what became a non-profit developer, providing development services to each project, securing like-minded investor finance through sort of private friends, families, clients of architects, essentially, is often the way that these are funded, and then essentially developing the project with ethical investment and balloting out to a wait list. And each time one of these goes out to the market, the ballots are dramatically oversubscribed. So right now there's thousands of people on the wait list for these homes. And when each project comes up, there's a sort of series of tiers of balloting. There's a priority ballot for First Nations people, healthcare workers, creative and cultural community. They get the first allocation of a percentage of dwellings, and beyond that, the dwellings are allocated on a sort of luck basis. So you see individual buildings, this sort of interesting, but it's not until we start to see the neighborhood scale effect. In plan, for those of you who have studied New York tenements, these might look slightly familiar to you. So in terms of this building type of very clear fronts, very clear backs, party wall condition, and a light well, all the apartments have cross ventilation, open air circulation, open air stairs, very much promoting that kind of passive interaction. Some of them sort of playing around more with sort of landing areas, and starting to sort of foster more sort of creative uses of these space. Some are a little bit more straight down the line. Interestingly, I'm talking to you from an apartment in this building right now. In terms of communal spaces, you can see there's been a lot of lessons over the years as each project is delivered. The residents and the designers compile their lessons. There's a lot of feedback back to the development team and a lot of corporate memory that's essentially established around what makes a successful rooftop. So the role of shade and shelter was a big failure in some of the early rooftops. They were very ambitious about how much of it was open. Our climate is incredibly windy and can be incredibly hot. And so having that ability for shelter, for walls, for sort of more intense planting really transform those spaces. You can see the communal laundries. So these are really super high amenity spaces. There are no laundries in apartments. These essentially are a communal asset. An ethical cleaning company, which has a contract with all the buildings, that rides bikes everywhere and doesn't use any chemicals, essentially supplies, cleans and maintains these spaces along with the common areas. And their business has grown with this model, interestingly. Air conditioners have typically not been provided with apartments, but these kind of resilient rooms are provided where there might be a communal space on the rooftop that's a sort of refuge in an event with poor air quality from bushfire or something like that, where people can kind of gather in the building. So you can see here, this is not an intentional community. Community have not been involved in informing the development, but inadvertently there's this kind of knowledge building over time from the community's operation of the building, which is feeding into the briefing, and an increasing sophistication around the infrastructure or those frayed ends that allow the community to form after the building is being completed.
Andy, I'm super sorry, but I have to leave. I informed everybody beforehand. I would love to talk to you another time. I wish you all the best. Sorry we couldn't have a conversation. Yeah, good luck today. Paul, I will call you later.
All right. Thank you
Very
very
sorry.
much, Marieke. Thank you very
All
much
right.
for your contribution.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Yeah. I'm quite close to the end. So this is the bit where I talk about the spatial pattern of this model. So if we look at this neighborhood here, which was upzoned in about 2008, you can essentially see limited amounts of development in 2010. There's now 1,800 residents in this block. So sitting at roughly 250 dwellings per hectare within this little pocket. But what you can start to see is this volume of development. So if you look at Nightingale's projects overall, a remarkable quantity of them are built within this one block and adjacent. So the sort of transformation of this neighbourhood over a 10-year period has been quite extraordinary. And the links that are being built between buildings, as much as what's being built within buildings, have started to become incredibly interesting. So where I live is essentially in what's called Nightingale Village, which was a development of 6 apartments built together. 6 architects co-funded each project. So each building was one contract, one developer, one finance facility, but each building, the equity component was secured by the architect who led that building. So it's essentially 6 proposals with 6 lots of equity, but a single overall project. And that creates remarkable sort of neighborhood diversity, many front doors to the street, extraordinary like community scales. 27 apartments is the lowest and the highest is 44. So you see this really intentional idea about breaking down the building scales, partly driven by finance, partly intent around community. These are some of the kind of communal spaces looking very naked before all the plants got established. It looks very different 2 years later. There's a community park which was developed by council through the acquisition of private property to the rear of these properties, which facilitated a sort of neighborhood heart. And what's really interesting is that nested within this larger model, one of the buildings is an intentional community. So the equity is provided by residents of a co-op called Urban Coop, essentially. It's an ownership model. They operate quite differently to the rest of the buildings. They don't have an owners corporation that administers the building. And they were able to make a lot of decisions about communal spaces from the outset. So within this one development model with, speculative components, private finance, etc., you've then got this nesting of secondary layers, one being the co-housing building, which could never have got access to land without this model, but then also 15% social housing incorporated from groups like Women's Property Initiative within that as well. This has continued to spread north along the neighbourhood with multiple buildings being produced. And this lovely sketch was just produced as sort of the last building in the row is being built right now and has just reached level 3. And you can start to see this incredible impact of having all these buildings together in an environment with exceptionally low levels of parking. There's probably, I'm going to say 25 cars across this entire precinct and 14 of them are go-gets in the basement, which are a car share that are available to the broader public. So the degree of public realm use, the degree of connectivity between these buildings is where a lot of the sort of extraordinary things have started to happen. So within our building, because of residents meeting during lockdown, getting to know each other during the construction, we bought a tenancy. So we controlled the ground plane outcome by 14 people forming a unit trust and buying the ground floor in order to dial the rent down and facilitate a social enterprise to be in the ground plane. So we start to see these beyond housing outcomes, as Marika was sort of talking to, because of this larger community forming around it. We also start to see this activation of the community, these festivals, these events. These are completely run by residents, forming a really strong network of bonds across the precinct. There's markets. There's a festival which is literally running this Saturday. We had 600 people come last year. It started to become this incredible nucleus for community activity because of the seeding of this development model over time, which has fostered this kind of intensive connection between people. And really where this model is becoming interesting is even within a master plan context, developers are using it as a way to support their larger project. So this project, not so far from 10 kilometres away from here, had 30 townhouses that took 18 months to get pre-commitment in order to build. The Nightingale component of the project balloted in a weekend, 52 apartments. The feasibility of that project being so popular actually de-risked the rest of the project and they changed the staging of their construction program. So you can see here where 10 years ago a developer would have gone, oh, this is risky, I don't know about this idea. Now it's actually a get out of jail card for a developer where that guarantee of supply from having such a big wait list allows them to actually rethink their staging strategy. Assemble is doing the same thing with Nightingale, where they're carving off a 25 apartment component of a project where they're worried about supply risk. They can then enable that to occur. And this is something that's continuing to build momentum as an idea of these kind of complex forms of partnership into rental housing and other forms of social housing collaboration as well. I will wrap up there.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much, Andy. Wow, it's very interesting that you showed this whole range of hybrid models, as you called them. Also, because of the context, these hybrid models, of course, appeared, and I think this kind of we need to share these kind of studies and put them all next to each other in order to sort of get an understanding of what is possible, because it's quite amazing. Very good. We have about 15 minutes left for some questions, a little bit of discussion. I have a couple of questions myself, actually, but let's start with you in the audience. who wants to start off or contribute, or who has a question for Andy?
Happy to talk about cooperatives too, if you want.
You could just continue. Yes, please go ahead with your question.
Yeah, actually, mine is not a question per se. Maybe if I may introduce myself, my name is Mwenje Emmanuel. I'm a lecturer at the Technical University of Kenya in urban regional planning with a special interest in resilience.
All right.
I developed my interest in resilience when I was a student at Erasmus University of Rotterdam.
Ah, okay.
To do a lot of public awareness, write-ups, I have a blog on LinkedIn, and even publication on mainstreaming resilience in urban planning. My observation relates to the models that have just been presented by the two presenters, because in Kenya, actually, we are trying to improve or provide housing, but in the name of affordable housing, but the model is actually quite anti people, because it has been made more or less as a tax, where those working, they are deducted 2.5% of their salaries towards the investment in the affordable housing, and that does not guarantee you ownership of the houses when they are done. So you are deducted money compulsorily, and you are also supposed to bid. You open an account with the government where you'll be contributing monthly towards the same house. But before you are allocated the house, you also be vetted for your eligibility. And since they are affordable houses, if you are above a particular income bracket, you may not be guaranteed to get the house. So interestingly, you are contributing towards the same as a tax. You are not guaranteed to own the house, because when they are done, you also need to buy the same house. So it's a very counterintuitive approach, which most Kenyans are not pleased with, because if you go to the rent to own model, the way some of the case studies have indicated, it becomes more encouraging for people to participate in the same. So I think this is an insightful presentation that I've just witnessed. Thank you.
Yeah. All right. Thank you very much. I missed the first part of your remark because of the my shaky connection. Sorry for that, but I think it's interesting to, as I said, to put these models next to each other and see how they interact. So thanks for that remark. Nadia, you want to contribute?
Yes, thank you, Andy, for this very interesting overview of different models of housing. I'm very curious to, as I experienced a lot, is that the people that can afford to do this are mostly very high educated people. So there is a kind of certain type of people that can afford, that can organize, that can understand a lot of things. Do these models also apply somehow for people that maybe are not so educated or socially in the lower ranges of the economic side of, as an urbanist? And what I also have in the Netherlands, we have a lot of agencies. Well, there are agencies that guide and help people that want to build their own houses and to guide them through the whole process. So it's a kind of new organization that is in the middle between, the government and between the people, and that's then the only way to do this. How does it work in Australia?
We have absolutely nothing like that. No, it's very much. It's very much, and there's a few points in there. One is the role of lower income groups and perhaps people with higher vulnerability and what models they have access to. It's sort of one piece. And the second was, what role does government play in this conversation? I think the first comment is that a lot of these models that are outside of the sort of normative operation of the market are reliant on people who can stump up the finance to sort of take that risk. And to date, that has tended to locate those, as I sort of showed, in the upper end of moderate at best and in the lower end of high income as well. And the devices to achieve affordability are limited when you're exposed to land values and construction costs and a mortgage, because essentially everything you build is exposing you to the market at precisely that point. There's no delay effect such as you might have on a cost rent scenario within a cooperative. So that has been quite limiting. The principal tool Nightingale has used has been to have voluntary inclusionary housing within their model. But the only way they can do that is by selling the units at a fixed price to the agencies who then operate them. So because there's no planning incentive for that to be provided, you're competing with another developer who could do nothing. You essentially wouldn't be able to buy the land unless you can build at that price. So there's internal cross subsidy. So certain dwelling types, I'm a top floor 2-bedroom, so mine would cross subsidize. The square meter rate is much higher than it would be for a bed sit or a studio and for the social housing. So to be very precise, I think my house was something like 9,600 Australian per square meter value rate. The social housing was capped at between 7,800 and 8,000 a square meter, as were the bed sit or smaller dwellings. So there's sort of small movements to sort of shift that price. Then the social housing provider is dependent still on finding the resources to buy that as well. So as opposed to being handed that at nil sum through a sort of planning transaction. So while it does mean from a community perspective, and back to the comment before about resilience, I live in a mixed community. I have 4 social housing residents who are fully integrated in this community. Really important members. Actually, their tenure stability is likely to be longer than any private renter by a factor of about 4, and it's likely to be commensurate with ownership social housing. So that's a really big factor in kind of in permanence. So in terms of the models that are focusing on the lower income groups, really we only have the kind of subsidized housing sector, which is incredibly dependent on grant rounds and access to sort of preferential finance. So there are government bond aggregators that are available, as well as capital grants, so essentially low interest debt, which supports that sector. The problem with that sector in Australia, as opposed to housing corporations in the Netherlands, is that because they are so geared towards the delivery of outcomes based on the sort of subsidy and grant round, it's very hard for them to do R&D, think in a future sense, and to create the resources to expand their model and innovate. Some are starting to do that. There's one called St George's in New South Wales who are starting to partner with investors themselves in order to seek diverse forms of finance to do mixed tenure communities, rather than, inclusionary housing with the developer just transfers the profit to the developer and socializes the problem, right? Whereas actually if the community housing provider secures their own finance in a mixed tenure project, they can actually see some benefit from that within their portfolio. So yeah, I always look at, again, like a Volcop or a Havensteder, and I look at that tradition of being entrepreneurial and building sky high starters, social housing within a mixed tenure model, and that ability for them to sort of recycle that into new projects. Here, there's a very narrow focus on the priority housing wait list, the availability of capital grants and subsidies. So the room for innovation, there's really been one provider in Victoria who's been looking at cooperative rental housing within the social space, and they're called Common Equity Housing Limited. But even their role over time has become reduced to just that. So they're operating the building differently once they've got the asset, but they're having to function within the housing system the same way because the government policy and finance is forcing them to behave as a recipient of handouts, essentially.
Okay. Thank you.
Tom could have answered that much better. Sorry.
We have only a couple of minutes left, and I think a lot of is shared already in the through the chat, which is very nice actually. So something starts to happen in terms of the sharing of these different models and how they come about. I myself had actually still quite a burning question. Started off with what Marieke showed, is huge difference between the rental price per square meter. Eh? So
Paul is frozen.
I think he was saying the discrepancy between the rental price in Germany and the Netherlands on the same cooperative housing models, which was pretty extraordinary. Does anyone have any insights on what might be the driver for that? Is that to do with KfW or certain access to finance that they have in Germany that's different to the Netherlands?
The land price.
And what we call erfpacht. So, and even in the Netherlands, you have a difference between municipalities. Amsterdam actually owns the grounds, and Rotterdam leased the ground because they sold it for very cheap a while ago now. So it's quite different, but this makes a big impact on the price of the ground when the projects buy it. So
essentially, are they a ground lease versus a freehold model? Is that what you're saying? So in the Netherlands context, someone has to buy the land, they're exposed to land price, then the rental, whereas in the German context, it's a ground lease and then a cash flow model, essentially.
And in the Netherlands, it depends of the municipality.
Okay.
Yeah.
In Amsterdam, you have to because the municipality is the owner of the ground, you have actually to add value at what you buy, because you cannot buy the ground. You need to lease it from the municipality.
And the whole finance of a lot of municipalities is depending on the income of what they buy in land. So that's mainly also a big part of their income.
Yeah. So sorry for dropping off again, but I can see Jonas, you stepped in. I'm afraid my burning question has to wait for another time.
Oh, we answered it, Paul.
I just didn't get the answer, but Jonas can tell me later. I'm pretty sure. I think we need to wrap up. I would like to thank Andy, of course, Marika as well, but she left already. But thank you very much, Andy, also for staying up so late to give us your great lecture. I'm so happy that you were able to contribute, and very nice to see your face again. So thanks for that as well. We will have another session in about a month's time. Perhaps Alan-Grete, can you come to the stage to tell us about what theme that will be?
Yes. So I have already put the link in the chat box for all of you. It has all the links for the upcoming ones, but particularly the next ones we will be having on the 30th of April. So it's again the last Wednesday of the month, and the focus would be more on retrofitting. So retrofitting within existing city limits. So if we are building, how can we really see it from spatial planning perspective and integrate certain things together in the within the city limits? And actually, we already have one of the speakers from next time who will be presenting today as well. Dennis Henrat is here. However, we will also be having two other speakers. Claudio, actually, he is also here. I just cannot see him right now anymore, but he was also here at the beginning. Yes, Claudio is here. And we will have a third speaker. So there will be three speakers discussing on this subject for particularly for retrofitting. So we will be hearing cases from Netherlands, Toronto, and from Claudio, overall perspective on the subject of retrofitting. That would be the next one. And the link is already here. And maybe last one thing to highlight, we have also started a LinkedIn channel, just particularly because the chat box has been filling up very nicely in the last sessions as well. So we want to put these links that you are sending us in the LinkedIn channel so that it can be also circulated among the whole group. So we want to continue this as a community of discussion till the end of the year to be able to have a concrete output out of it. So please join us in LinkedIn. Eva has shared the link. We'll send it to you again through emails and through final things. That's
Yes, great. Thank you very much, Alankrita. And as some of you might know, because you were there, we started this series with a brainstorm with all of you, looking at what themes we should be focusing on. And I think it would be very nice if you reach out to us also with ideas for continuing this conversation, but also with ideas for how can we work closer together. What kind of methods would be useful in order to have this sharing of ideas platform really taking off. So I hope you want to respond to that, and please give your reactions. You can always reach out to IFHP or to us for doing that, and of course also through the LinkedIn platform. So once again, thank you very much, Andy, and thank all of you for joining, and I hope to see you again next time. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.
Thanks again.
And see you,
Thank
Andy,
you.
soon in
Bye-bye.
June in person.